This is an example of a painting done using negative space. So instead of painting the bird, I painted everywhere around the bird. And I'm going to show you how to do that step by step, doing jellyfish. So the first step was to draw the jellyfish, and truly this is the longest step of all. Now what I need to do is I need to go over my darkest parts of the lines with with an eraser, and to lighten the pencil lines, because everywhere where you can see the pencil easily, once I wet the paper, those lines are permanent. So this is just one of those kneaded erasers, and it works really, really well. So I'm going to lighten as many of these pencil lines as I can. My pencil lines have all been lightened, and I've set up my palette. So I have picked gamboge yellow, phthalo blue or intense blue, dioxazine violet, and permanent rose. Normally you should stick with 3 colors for any beginner's painting. I'm using 4 because they're my 4 favorite colors, and Picasso's the one who said know the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist. So there you go. Now the secret to doing painting that is as complex as this jellyfish is to do little tiny areas at a time, to not try to do big huge areas. Otherwise you might get confused as to which are the areas that you are supposed to be leaving white and which are the areas that you're supposed to be coloring in. So what I'm doing is I started off with my purple and I dropped in my pink, because I'm trying to blend these 2 colors, and these 2 colors are close enough on the color wheel that it's not going to cause an issue. It doesn't matter whether I start with my light or my dark, because the whole idea is that I'm going to have both in there. But normally the rule is you always start with your lightest color and you move to your darker colors. So in this next little section here, oh, I got a cat hair on my brush. One moment. Okay, so then in this next section here, I'm going to start with the pink. And I'm not going to do an area larger than that at a time, because this is work where I do not want it to dry. If it dries, if those paint lines that I just drew dry, I'm going to end up with permanent lines. And the whole point is to have a very wet looking effect there. At this point in the painting, it's a little bit more obvious which are the areas I'm coloring in and which are the areas that I'm not. So what I have done now is I've started filling in the spaces between the tentacles, and everywhere where the line is eventually going to continue down. At the moment, what I've done is I've just softened the line so you can't see a hard edge when it dries. I might end up with a hard edge right there, but I will be able to fix that. The most important thing I need to keep in mind at this point is that I don't want the parts I'm painting to touch where I have any pencil, because then that pencil line will become obvious. It's not so much a problem if you're using dark colors like the purple, but it will definitely be obvious where the pink is. Now that I've completed the top part of the jellyfish and the area in between the tentacles, you can see that I'm just working on each section very, very lightly to fill in all of the spaces. So what I will be left with are the negative spaces, which are in white, and then I will have all the areas in the tentacles, in between the tentacles, done in a light pink or light purple, or a combination of the 2. Then after it's dried, I can always go back and I can always add more in. But the idea is at first just to fill in all the spaces, knowing that none of those lines have to be at their absolute darkest at this point. I can always go in and do a second layer on top. But most importantly, I want to make sure that my lines are flowing and that I'm not ending up with any hard edges, just soft edges. Okay, so my next step now is to erase all the pencil lines. It's going to be very difficult to see in some spots where my white ends and my paint begins. That's the whole idea. I suggest you use an artist eraser. These erasers are great because you can rip them apart, you can mold them. If you're trying to erase a teeny tiny space in a pencil drawing, you can mold it into a point. It works really well in two ways. You can dab it like this. I actually had a student last night in my class that was rolling it like it was a dough with a rolling pin. It was very, very effective. You can just use it as a normal eraser, but it doesn't have all that feathery stuff there. So they're very inexpensive. I recommend that you get one. However, just be aware of the fact that if you have furry creatures in your house, they love to steal them, they love to chew them, and then you will find them covered in cat hair underneath the coffee table in the living room. So I'm going to erase all my pencil lines, and then I will show you what the next step is. Is this little jellyfish in the corner, and I'm going to do it a little bit different. I'm going to outline this area where there's tentacles, but I'm not actually going to go in there and do the work because it's going to be really, really fine and it's just going to be very difficult. So first I'm just going to do a negative space around the outside of the entire area. And again, I'm going to use those same colors. So I'm using the permanent rose. And it's always good to have a little test paper to check. I wasn't using a test paper earlier, but I recommend to all my students that they use a test paper. That way they can see. Once you've been painting for quite a while, you have a better idea of just how much pigment each of your brushes holds and exactly how much water to use. But until you're figuring all that out, and even when you're a pro, you should always be using a test paper. So I'm doing the exact same thing I was doing before. I'm lining an area, then I'm cleaning my brush. If I think I have too much water on the brush, I can just dab it with my sponge. And now I'm just softening that edge so I won't end up with a hard line around the outside of the jellyfish. I'm going to do that all along the jellyfish, and like I said, just the outside area of the tentacles. Air bubbles here. I'm doing a wet on wet technique. So I've already wet this area. You can see it's shiny with water. And then I am lining the circles, the bubbles, and you can immediately see how that paint is flowing down into the wet area. It's going to flow unevenly, and it's going to actually look quite nice because it's going to look just like it would be underwater. And then I'm doing the same thing I did before. I'm softening those lines so they're not a hard line. So I'm going to wet this area underneath. And now when I outline, I'm going to have it flow mostly in the down direction from the water because my table's on a slant. So we get a really, really nice flowy effect there. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to develop this area in here. And so I'm going to turn my book. It's always nice to turn your book or turn your board. And then you also get the added benefit of your paint will flow in different directions as a result of however you have your board tipped or tilted. So I'm just going to play with this area, see what sort of interesting shapes I can get developing it. And then after I've done that with the pink, then I will go in with the purple afterwards. Now I could switch to a smaller brush at this point, and I think I will just go to more of a liner brush at this point. It's a very common mistake for people who are just starting out to switch to smaller brushes long before they should. You want to save your smaller brushes for the very, very end when you're doing the fine details. But because this is quite a lighter, smaller area that I'm trying to do, I don't want to have my lines as thick as they do for the other areas on here. So I think that's going to give me a much nicer, more of a fine line. That's more what I'm looking for. And I'm going to have some spots where it doesn't touch, and that's totally okay, because who's to say that they would all be really far apart. So I'm just going to play with this for a little bit, and then I'm going to decide, once I've taken a look at it from far away, it's important that we look at our work from far away, not just from close up. I'll decide how much more I'm going to develop with the other colors. So this little jellyfish up here really needed a lot more detail so I could figure out exactly what I was drawing, because you can't just go over your mistakes as easily with watercolors as you can with acrylics. I felt it was fairly important for me to go in and draw. So now that I've done that, I have really made this a little bit more complicated for myself, because now I have to go in and do all these teeny tiny little spaces in between there. But that's okay. It'll just take a little bit of time, and as long as I go slow, I'll be happy with the result. I just have to be careful not to rush. Okay, so I finished doing the tentacles of the jellyfish, and I can't erase these pencil lines until this area is completely dried. So while I'm waiting for that, I'm going to fix a couple of mistakes. I've got one mistake right here. I have a hard line, and I don't want to have a hard line there, so I need to soften that up. And then my other thing that I need to develop a little bit further is these spots where it's the back side of the jellyfish that's showing through. I need to make them darker than the area where it's just water around the jellyfish. So in order to fix this hard line, you want to get a Kleenex handy. Keep it in one hand, keep it very, very close. So as you're going through and lightening the area, you can dab at the same time. So I'm just going, this is just clean water on my brush, and I'm just pretending like I'm rubbing. Now this is quite a light pink that I'm trying to pick up, so I don't have to worry about what kind of a brush. Pretty much any brush will soften this line for me quite nicely. But if I was trying to erase a really dark color, I would use a stipple brush instead. And if I had one handy, I'd show it to you. Now the next error I need to fix is around here. You can see where when the paint dried, when I did a second layer around there, it didn't actually dry nicely. So I'm just going to take my permanent rose, and I'm going to go over pretty much the entire bottom half. I don't want to do the two areas that need to be fixed separate. If I make it all one, then it will look like it's supposed to all be attached. And now I'm just softening the edges. And hopefully when that dries now, we won't have such an obvious spot around there. However, I do see now that I've got a dark spot right there, and I could actually leave that, because that would certainly be a normal thing that you would see, light and dark spots as flecks in the water are shown through. And because I've got some purple on this edge, I'm just going to drop in some purple along where I filled in, just to give it a little bit more of a color flow, as opposed to a color stopping when it gets to a particular area. And I really want that to flow, so I'm going to wet this lots. Really big area that I'm going to wet. And in fact, I think what I will do is I will wet all the way down to this area that I've already done. Now whenever you're doing wet on wet work, and that's what I'm going to be doing for developing the background, you want to wet much larger area than the area you're working, because the last thing you want is for your paint to reach the edge of the area that you've wet and then stop and end up with a hard line. So I'm going to go all the way around my two air bubbles here, and I'm just going to wet all that, so everything that I've just put in there can now flow nicely. And now is the really fun part. So I'm just going to put some permanent rose, and I'm just going to drop it in. We're going to see how much that flows. It's flowing a bit. And now the dioxazine violet is quite strong, so I don't need nearly as much of it as I do the pink. We'll just see how that goes. If it ends up being, oops, if it ends up being too blotchy, I can lift it out, but I don't think it's going to be too blotchy. Seems to be flowing quite nicely. There's a couple spots here where it's a little bit lighter. Now, because I'm adding water around an area that I already wetted, I've now made some of these areas more wet than others, and that's going to cause the cauliflower effect. Cauliflower effect is wonderful when you want it. It's really frustrating when you don't want it. So the secret to learning how to control having a cauliflower effect happen is just to do it lots. And the more you do it, the more you recognize, right, this is how come it's happened. And then you can make it happen when you want it to happen. But when you don't want it to happen, then it doesn't happen. So I'm gonna end up with some cauliflower effects in here. And I'm gonna be quite happy with that because again, it's underwater. So we can have that nice softening effect. So I'm just gonna leave this. I'm not gonna play with it anymore. I'm gonna let this layer dry and then we're gonna see how it looks. Okay, so what I have done is I have done a second layer of the pink in this area here. And that's so I get those brighter colors. All the bright colors that I absolutely love in all my paintings are a result of many, many layers. You can never get the colors you want in the first layer. And the other thing you need to remember with watercolors as well is that watercolors always lighten lighter than they are when they're wet. So as soon as they're dry, you're going to notice that they are lighter. Now you can see in this area here where I dropped in the purple and the pink, it flowed together really nicely and I'm very, very happy with that. So that's just great. Now all I'm going to do is I'm going to continue developing the background. I'm going to add in a little bit of yellow because yellow is going to just act like we've got some sunshine coming through. Now I have to be careful because yellow and purple make brown and I don't want to make brown. And yellow and pink are obviously going to give me more of an orange. So I'm going to put some yellow in some spots, but I'm not going to go too crazy on the yellow. And I actually have a happy accident right here. Somehow I got some yellow on my paper. So good. That just means it's going to look like it belongs. So again, I'm wetting an area that is way larger than the area that I actually want to paint, because this way everything will flow. And because I have an overhead light on, you should be able to tell where I've wet because it'll look shiny to you. It's not quite as obvious from where I am, but most importantly, I'm just trying to do large area. Okay, so I'm going to use gamboge, which is this yellow here. It looks so yucky brown when it's dried in the palette, in the pan, but it is just beautiful. Okay, and I'm not going to go too crazy. And then because I want to add, I want to make it cohesive, I'm going to add a little bit of yellow down here in the bottom, but I'm not going to do that right now. Now there's a really neat effect that you can do with salt in watercolors. And when I was first introduced to the salt technique, I thought this is so much fun. And I tried a little bit and it worked really well. So then I tried a lot more and I discovered that less is more. I just kept putting more and more and more on, and wouldn't you know it, the more you put on there, the less it works. And the more you put on it, you end up with these piles that just stick there. And I mean, it looks neat, but it's definitely not the salt effect that you're going for. So I just literally take a few grains of salt, and I'm just going to sprinkle it on the yellow. Now it's not going to be as obvious with the yellow. It's going to be much more obvious when I do my pink layer and my purple layer after this, but you will be able to see a little bit of it with the yellow. It is going to be pretty subtle. So the salt just absorbs the paint and dries out that area really quickly. So then you end up with a really bright spot, and you'll end up with what almost looks like snowflakes in the areas around it. So it'll just be very neat. And again, I need to stop. I have to not play and I have to let this layer dry. So I'm going to get up so I'm not tempted to touch it and wreck it.
Okay, so the yellow area has dried, and you can see that the yellow flowed quite nicely, and it is a little bit lighter than it was when it was wet. Since that time, I have also developed this bottom right hand area, and I did the exact same thing. I wet the whole area. I dropped in with my brush drops of the pink and the purple, and then I sprinkled just a tiny bit of salt, and you can see these wonderful crystal-like shapes that really add to it. They almost look like tiny little jellyfish in the background, so that worked really well. Since then as well, I've had a happy accident. My cat has walked across my painting. He had muddy paw prints from being outside, and he did a big step right here. I'm thinking he must have walked in my gamboge and then walked across my painting. He also left some muddy paw prints up here. So anyway, that's a happy accident. It happens all the time. When accidents happen in our work, there's no point in us getting really, really frustrated and angry about it, because we can learn from them. And so I'm thinking I'm actually going to end up putting some of the yellow in this part, just because I've got yellow there. I might as well go with it, go with the flow, right? Besides, the trick to making good art is to make lots and lots of bad art, and that way you learn from your mistakes. So this is just one more opportunity for me to learn from my mistakes. So I've developed this side. I'm quite happy with that. I'll just pull it up so you can see it a little bit closer. Really, really happy with those crystal-like shapes you can see in there. And I'm just going to do a little bit more of that same idea on top. It's not going to look as obvious because I already have a background color here, but I'm going to do the same technique I did there, and I'll get a few of the spots. And then up here and over here, I'm going to do the exact same thing. So this is the wet on wet technique. That means wet your paper. Then you're going to drop very liquidy or wet paint into those spots. And then we're just going to add a little bit of salt. So I will do one spot to show you exactly what I mean. When you're using wet on wet, it's really important that you make sure you're using clean water. Remember, as soon as your water is not clean enough for a goldfish to live in it, it's time to change your water. So I'm just going to go around the white areas because I don't want to lose my white. Okay, and again, one of the rules when you're doing wet on wet is to not do an area that is too large, because if you do an area that is too large, chances are it is going to dry before you get a chance to do the whole area. So I'm just using my palette here just to check. I'm going to drop a few spots of pink in there, and I'm going to drop in some purple. Purple is much more opaque, so I will not need as much purple. Okay, so I've just done a few spots, and then same idea, taking just a few tiny grains of salt and sprinkling it on there. And we're just gonna let it do its own thing. So I'm just gonna keep repeating the same steps. So step 1 is wet the area. Step 2, drop a few drops of paint in. Step 3, sprinkle a little bit of salt in each area. So I'm going to do that, and then I will show you the result. Okay, I've wet this area in here, and because I didn't realize I had the paper so close to the bottom of the screen, I'm just going to show you again. Just a few drops with the purple, and then a few drops with my favorite pink. And you can see they're already starting to flow. Then I just take a few grains of the salt. And remember, with salt, less is more. Okay, and now I'm not going to touch. I'm not going to muck it. I'm just going to leave that one area. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing in these areas around here. And then I will show you what that looks like. Okay, I have finished developing the top area around this little jellyfish, and as well I did the top area in here. So I want to explain how I made sure that my yellow and my purple didn't mix and give me a yucky color. What I did when I was developing this area is I wet the entire top, not just where the yellow is, but all of it, and I was very careful to go around the circles. As well, I went as close as I could to the white line that is the top of the jellyfish, so the background didn't look like it was something that was added later. I wanted it to look like it was one solid continuous form. So that's why I wet from where my brush is, all the way up, all the way across, and all the way down that entire area. Then I just dropped in a few drops, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, not very many, and I made sure where I dropped them wasn't on top of a yellow spot, but next to or around the yellow spot. That way, when the pinks and the purples flowed, I didn't have to worry as much about them going directly over top. And then I did the same thing over here, and I ended up with some really nice little salt effects. Now I have some cauliflower effects. For those of you that don't know what a cauliflower effect is, it also goes by a couple other names. This is one right here. As well, I have one right there, and I have one right there. And they actually look like, if you were to look up very, very close, they actually almost look like the top of a piece of cauliflower. And these happened because this area was more wet than this area here. So the wet area, the paint was flowing, and it was flowing in this direction, hit the barrier between the less wet area and the more wet area, and then the paint can't move into that other area. And it ends up pooling all along the boundary, but the boundary isn't a straight line or a round line. It's all a whole bunch of little wiggles. So that's where you get the cauliflower shape. It looks great if you're trying to do it on purpose for something like under the water. So the next step now is to take a step back. I need to look at it from far away, and I need to decide if there's any areas that I want to develop further. I also have a tendency to look at a painting the day later, or 2 days later, sometimes even 3 days later, and I'll see things that I didn't see before. So I would suggest you take a few days, prop it up somewhere where you'll walk by it all the time. You'll get to see it from close up and from far away. I often put mine in my kitchen, on my kitchen counter, because then I'll see them when I'm walking across the room, walking from the other end of the house. And it's also a good idea to take a look at them under different light. So if it's a bright day, you might see some things that you didn't see if you had it in your living room and you had your curtains closed. So those are just a couple things to keep in mind. And once I've done that, then I'm going to see if there's any more areas that I want to work on. Now, my happy accident has actually become more of a happy accident or an unhappy accident. And now where I scrubbed I tried putting in an extra layer of paint on top, and it's actually bled into that area. So in my opinion, it actually looks more like an accident than it did before. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do. I could either leave it as is. I could try going over that with a white gouache, which is a permanent white. It's almost an acrylic paint, and it would cover up that, or I could just leave it. So I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do. I'm going to think about it, I'm going to sleep on it, and I'm going to see what I come up with tomorrow. So this has completely dried. It's now the next day, and I'm looking at it under different lighting conditions just to see if I'm happy with it. And I have to say I am. I'm quite happy with it. The yellow up here in the corner is quite light and gentle, and I was thinking of adding some more yellow just to sort of make it feel like it's more of a piece that's got some balance to it. But now I've decided, no, I'm not going to do that. The sunlight would be coming into the water, but it wouldn't be going down into the bottom area. So I'm going to leave this bottom area nice and dark the way I have it, and I'm not going to play with this anymore. I've also had a chance to sleep about my happy accident here, and I'm going to leave it. I'm actually going to leave it. I showed it to my husband, and I explained what the cat had done, and he couldn't even find it until I pointed it out. So I'm just going to leave this mark here. It's just part of the originality. It's just part of the story of the painting. And so now is the most important part. Now is the time to sign it and to date it, and on the back to write what I like, what I don't like, what worked, what didn't work, what I would do differently next time. Because remember, this isn't about perfection. This is about progress. Salvador Dali, who's the famous artist that does all of those paintings with those clocks that are like dripping off things, he said, do not fear perfection. you will never achieve it. So that's something to remember. This is all about learning, and this is about having fun and relaxing. I will attach with this video a sketch of the jellyfish, so if you wanted to do this at home, you have something that you can work from and you don't have to worry about trying to draw the jellyfish on your own. I hope you really enjoyed this. If you did, please share. I would love your comments. I would love positive feedback, negative feedback, everything and anything. As well, I'd love to see what sort of things you're working on, and please stay tuned for more videos, more tips, and previews on upcoming workshops and classes.